Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to whoever has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question is yet again one which I would never really have thought to ask myself, and there's a very good reason for that, and we'll come to that in a moment. Today's question is very interesting, and it goes as follows. Dear Archaeosoup, what is it like to live in a country where the ruined buildings of medieval monasteries are in the landscape? We do not have them where I come from. It must be peculiar to see these abandoned churches all across the countryside, for sure. Any ideas? Your videos are wonderful, Martina. Well, Martina, thank you very much. I'm glad that you like our videos at Archaeosoup Towers. But you ask a very interesting question, and actually you highlight something which every now and then I have a moment of clarity and I realise is peculiar. But for the most part, I don't even notice, and that is the proliferation of ruined monastic sites across the UK, in particular Wales, England and Ireland, actually. Although obviously Ireland is not all part of the UK. Not now anyway. But anyway, yes, you're right, they're everywhere, and I just take it for granted, usually. Every now and then I'll have a sort of a moment where I go, this is kind of weird, isn't it? All these ruined churches in the countryside as you're driving along. But actually, it's for the most part something which is just part of the DNA of the British countryside, are these ruined monasteries everywhere. Now, this isn't in other countries. I'm not quite sure where you're from, Martina, I'm sorry to say. You could be American, possibly, could be Italian, I'm not sure, going just by your name, Martina. But, Martina, you're quite right. It is not the case in other countries, in particular in Europe, that so many sites have been left either to fall into ruin or have been actively destroyed at some point in the past. Now, the reason why this is the case in the UK is because of the Reformation, which is a very polite word for another phrase, which is the dissolution, or I suppose the dissolving of the power of the church in Britain. Now, this happened under King Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541, and famously is part of the big split in the church. It resulted in the Church of England as we know it today, and the Catholic Church, which does not recognise the Church of England as being part of its communion. In other words, Henry VIII, because he wanted an annulment for his marriage, his wedding vows, he wanted them to be deemed to be invalid. He actually tore the church apart, and with it he brought all of the assets, all of the property, the lands, the land rights and the resources therein. He brought those under the purview of the state, of the crown, and he started to either just downright destroy these sites or to hand them off to friends and loyal supporters. So, for example, on some sites there may well be a ruling that all the buildings must be rendered uninhabitable. So none of the buildings, all the roofs have to come off, walls have to be collapsed, this kind of thing. But whoever now owns or is in charge of this estate, essentially, can use some of this rubble to build their own house on that land. Henry and the Reformation forever changed the British landscape, in particular the English landscape, and has resulted in some of these great, what we now think of as these ancient country houses. Some of these actually have their roots from this time or at this time. Now, there are various types of ecclesiastical architecture in Britain, especially the abandoned ones, and these fall under words like abbey, priory, monastery, convent and friary, this kind of thing. But they're all words which mean loosely the same thing, a religious community, and they live on or in a complex of buildings, usually on a parcel of land which they own and look after. The difference between these different groups these different communities really boils down to how they interact with the people around them. So, for example, are they very isolated, or do they go out into the community around them? Do they, for example, offer medical care, this kind of thing? How much do they have to acknowledge vows of chastity and vows of silence, this kind of thing? Whether or not they are led by an individual or led by as a community. Whether or not there are men and women, monks and nuns, or whether or not there are simply just single-sex communities, so just nuns or just friars. These different distinctions are what make these different words. But broadly speaking, I think you're right. The word monastery or abbey is quite useful in this context. Now, one of the results of this seismic shift in the religious direction of this country is that we do have these amazing sites, often hauntingly beautiful, these ruins, which are dotted around the landscape. And two of the most amazing and beautiful ruined monasteries or abbeys are actually to be found in the north of England. I'm thinking in particular of Revo Abbey and also Fountains Abbey. I'll return to those in a moment. But really, the heart of your question, I guess, was what is it like to live with these ruins around you? Well, it's kind of like this, really. Tynemouth Priory and Castle is located on a rocky outcrop jutting into the North Sea at the mouth of the River Tyne. Located around 5 miles from Archaeology Towers, Tynemouth is a delightful coastal village, and at the end of its high street stand the ruins of Tynemouth Priory. During the time of the Saxon kings, 3 were buried at Tynemouth, and the site became a place of pilgrimage and eventually a church and priory. In its history, the site was plundered by Vikings and even fortified by the time the Normans arrived. The site went on to be a castle and priory. In the mid to late 17th century, this rock outcrop became the site of a lighthouse, much needed in these treacherous waters. And of course, these ruins became the focus of leisurely strolls and curious artists. In the 19th century, the site was refortified, and by the time of the Second World War, big guns were in place, guarding the mouth of the River Tyne. And this is the long and varied story of Tynemouth Priory, some of the most majestic ecclesiastical ruins on my doorstep. So in the case of our local ruined priory, Tynemouth Priory, it has had a very colourful and varied history, and it is actually still at the heart of a community, oddly enough. It's right there on the high street. It's also a massive ruin. It is, as you say, or as you have pointed out, it is a slightly bizarre thing, is it not? Now, the specific histories of other sites have resulted in them being either folded into, I suppose, estates and these sort of communities which are based around grand houses, or they've become almost like follies in the landscape. Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire was sold along with 500 acres of land by the Crown on the 1st of October 1540. It was stripped of useful materials and ended up in the hands of Sir Stephen Proctor in 1597. He used stone from the monastic complex to construct Fountains Hall, and in so doing he stamped a new focus of ownership on the estate. In the case of Revo Abbey, which also happens to be in North Yorkshire, the king ordered that the buildings become uninhabitable, stripped, for example, of lead from the roof. The site was granted to one of his advisors and eventually passed into the hands of the Duncombe family. As was the fashion, in the mid-18th century, Thomas Duncombe III added follies to the landscape in the Romano-Greek style. This was a sculpted landscape intended for visual pleasure and leisurely walks. This was the heyday of gardeners such as Capability Brown. And the ruins at Revo fitted into this new landscape narrative. They became effectively giant garden ornaments. But also often the negotiations surrounding the closure and destruction of these sites did actually get rather messy. There's a site called Norton Priory in the northwest of England, which which really its breakup was quite an acrimonious affair, where people were arguing over what bits of land they wanted because their estates were sort of next to the priory, or perhaps the person who was overseeing the tearing up of the site was actually friends with the person in charge at the priory, and so you had all these people arguing and bickering and basically tearing the flesh off a corpse in a rather undignified way. So sometimes the transition was relatively straightforward and simple. People basically were evicted from their monastic site, and whoever was in charge of that portion of land simply took over the running of it and started apportioning out resources and the use of the land to people in whatever way they saw fit. But in other cases, such as at Norton Priory, it was really a much more brutal affair and a much less civilized affair. So you shouldn't get the impression that somehow the Reformation was easy. I mean, hopefully you don't anyway. But I think Norton Priory in particular really highlights that actually people had really crass considerations in some cases when it came to the dissolution of these and the destruction of these sites. But that's, I suppose, hopefully gone some way to answering your question, Martina. It's a very interesting one. And as I say, it's one, every day, if we go out for a drive out of the city, we're going to come across usually one of these ruins. They'll be near the road or something, or just off in the distance. And because of that, we are in Britain, I think, slightly numb to the fact that this is slightly unusual. What we're witnessing is actually are the vestiges of a way of life which was decimated by Henry VIII during the Reformation. A fascinating thing to be reminded of. So thank you so much for that question, Martina. If you have any thoughts or comments, please do comment below. I'm sure Martina would love to read what you have to say, and indeed so would I. I really want to see if there's any other thoughts or ideas or any other stories actually of other sites on these islands which are worthwhile hearing about, because I've only highlighted a few here, but it is a fascinating process which happened, and the results of which we're still living with to this day. So once again, thank you so much for that, Martina, and well, that's it. As ever, guys, until next time, whatever you're doing, do take care. Bye bye.